What's up guys, I'm Brad Rodriguez from Fix This Build That, and today I'm going to show you how to make the perfect workbench for your garage workshop. It's got a large work surface and a place to sit and do some work. It's got a ton of storage with 5 drawers on each cabinet, and it's got a hutch with built-in pegboard storage and a light. Stay tuned, I'll show you just how I did it. I modeled this build after the setup that I've been using for over a decade here. It's two 15-inch cabinets on either side with a 60-inch top and a pegboard hutch. I'm going to leave out the center cabinet down below for now and make this a nice workbench or shop desk. And my dad's going to be getting the old version for his garage. I'm going to walk through the full build here, but this is basically a mashup of the garage base cabinets I just made and my drill press stand that I made last year. Now I'm going to share a lot of tips and insights to make this build or any similar one go smoother. I'm building both cabinets at the same time out of 3/4 inch Baltic birch plywood. Each side piece gets a toe kick notch, which I marked for and cut on the bandsaw. And if you're cutting these with a jigsaw, you can stack 2 sides together and cut them both at once, since you don't have a fence for repeated cuts like I do here. The cabinet sides are joined together by a bottom piece and 4 stretchers. And you want the width of the bottom and the length of the stretchers to be exactly the same, so take the extra time and make sure they match up when you're cutting them. An out of square cabinet here makes everything down the road a lot harder. And with a small cabinet like this, connecting the sides is a lot easier since you can use smaller clamps. I held the stretchers in place between the sides and attached them with pocket screws. And when putting the bottom on, make sure to check that it's 90 degrees to both the sides and your workbench before attaching it. If the bottom slopes from the front to the back of the cabinet, this can foul up your drawer install if you'll be using spacers like I do. The back stretchers are secured to the top and bottom to firm up the whole assembly and give an attachment point for anchoring to the wall. I'm using the same homemade adjustable leveling feet for the cabinets as I did before. I cut 3x3 blocks to beef up the base for the T-nuts that are going to be installed. Then I attached the blocks with glue and brad nails and moved on to the drawer slides while the glue dried. I typically install my slides with the cabinet sitting upright, but this time I tried it with the cabinet on its side. It's a bit easier doing it this way since you don't have to clamp the spacers in place or worry about the slides tipping over as you go to grab some screws. Just make sure that the slides remain at a right angle to the front of the cabinet since you don't have gravity holding everything down firmly to the bottom here. I have full detailed plans available for this whole build, including the exact measurements for the drawers, slides, and all the other parts. There's a link in the description, you can go check that out. To close up the cabinets, I cut backs for them out of 1/4 inch plywood, and I attached them with glue and staples to finish up the carcass. You can use brad nails as well, but staples are going to really hold better in a thin wood like 1/4 inch plywood. Next up was the drawers. I'm making 10 of them here, which means 40 parts with 4 different widths and 2 lengths. So having a cut list here is clutch, especially if you're trying to use odd size materials and offcuts from other projects like I did. I printed out the layout on my parts from SketchUp to get the most from each piece of plywood. Then I labeled the plywood with exactly what parts I needed to get from it. I set the table saw fence for each width I needed, and I cut all the parts that were that size. And after I cut the parts, I marked them off the little sticky note and kept that little note on the plywood until I'd gotten what I needed from each piece of plywood. Now this might seem like overkill, but I can't tell you how many times that I've tried to wing it and I end up cutting the wrong parts out of the wrong piece, and then I end up having to buy more wood. And like they say, an ounce of planning is worth $48 of Baltic birch, or something like that. Now cutting the drawer fronts and backs to their final size is always a little bit tricky when using plywood. The total drawer width should be 1 inch narrower than the opening to account for the slides. And an easy way to check the sizing before you cut your parts is to do a dry fit in the cabinet. Use scraps to represent the sides and the front and see if they're going to move easily between the slides. Being a little bit under versus over is a better side to err on for a good fit and easy sliding drawers. I took the stack of parts back to the pocket hole jig and I drilled the fronts and the backs. And putting the drawers together goes pretty quick with a set of clamps to help things along. And if you need a pocket hole jig, a set of clamps, or even drawer slides, check out Woodcraft, the sponsor of today's video. They carry a full assortment of woodworking power tools, accessories, and finishes. And they have stores in over 70 metro cities in the US and a full assortment on their website. I'm going to have links down below in the description to all the items I used today in the build. And thanks again to Woodcraft for sponsoring this video. I finished off the drawers by cutting full-size 1/4 inch bottom panels for the boxes. If your drawer box is a little out of square, there's an easy way to fix it here. Line up the bottom and staple the panel to the front edge, flush with the front of the box. And if the reveal running down the side isn't consistent, then just use the bottom panel and pull the side into square to make that reveal consistent and fix it into place with staples. You can finish up with more staples along the side and that thing's not going to move. After finishing the drawers, I moved back to the cabinet base. I drilled holes in the blocks that I installed earlier for the leveling feet. Each foot gets a 5/16 of an inch T-nut and a 2-inch carriage bolt that allows for leveling on uneven garage floors. And all garages should slope from front to back, so you're going to need these. I finished off the base by installing a toe kick on each cabinet with brad nails. I should really start calling these me nails more often. Maybe not. The last cabinet parts to make were the false drawer fronts. I cut them to size out of a large sheet of plywood to get that continuous grain look that I love so much. Then I applied 2 coats of water-based polyurethane to the fronts and the cabinet sides. Installing the drawers becomes pretty straightforward at this point, save for some minor adjustments. I used a 1/4 inch spacer for the bottom drawer, and then I stacked on a 3/4 inch piece for the next 2 drawers. Now the plywood that I'm using was even more undersized than normal, and that's going to add up after several drawers. So if your spacing gets too far off, you can get drawer bottoms and fronts running into each other, and that is no bueno. So an easy way to check where you're at and see if there's any interference is to mock up the fronts using an 1/8 of an inch spacer between them. And then you can see if there's anything going on between the drawers. And this one wasn't hitting, but I wanted to move it up anyway just to be safe since it was a little too close. Now before mounting the drawer fronts, I went ahead and I drilled the holes for the pulls first. Then I started at the bottom and I attached them to the drawer boxes with 1 1/4 inch pocket screws from the inside. After getting them all installed, I finished them off by extending the holes for the pulls all the way through the drawer box and attaching the hardware on the front. At the top of the workbench is a plywood panel trimmed in hardwood like my other cabinets. I cut the panel to size and I used 3/4 inch maple for the trim. Now to cut the trim to the right width, I used 2 pieces of plywood to set the fence. And this gave me about a 1 3/8 of an inch trim, which will marry up perfectly with the double stack of plywood that I'll be using on the edge. I attached the front trim to the top with pocket screws and glue, leaving the trim long on each side. Instead of leaving the side pieces long like I've done before, I went ahead and trimmed them to the exact size and joined them the same way as I did the front. After those were attached, I came back with a flush cut saw and trimmed off the excess length of that front trim. Instead of using 2 full-size pieces of plywood for the top, I used 3-inch strips along the edges and the front and the back to build it up and have a place to attach the lower cabinets. I glued and screwed the pieces down, and I put 2 more small strips in between the front and the back where the cabinets would overlap on that inner edge. I wrapped up the top by sanding all the seams flush and applying 2 coats of polyurethane. The finishing touch on the workbench is the hutch. I love having that light right above the workbench, and all that pegboard is great for easily accessible storage. So I left the design pretty much the same, but just made it a little bit sturdier. It's a 2-piece hutch with a frame for the pegboard held between the sides and top. I use pocket hole joinery for the whole thing for easy assembly, and it's pretty big, so you might need some extra support, like scraps stacked on top of the cabinets that you just made. Note to self, make that larger assembly table. Pronto. Now considering the size of this hutch, putting finish on the parts before assembly also makes this task a lot easier. After making the frame, I joined the sides and the top of the hutch together. Then I moved on to the pegboard. I'm using just a basic white pegboard here, and I cut it to size to fit the frame. Now to assemble the hutch, I turned the top upside down and I brought over the frame. I clamped it on and I used some offcuts of the pegboard to set the frame forward a bit so that it would be flush on the back when it was attached. Now, working my way around the hutch, I connected the frame to the top and the sides with pocket screws. At this point, I brought over the 4-foot LED light that I'm going to be using, and I measured it for placement in the mounting hardware. I drilled holes and I installed some screw hooks, which I decided to replace with some screw eyes, which were a little bit smaller. You'll see that in a minute. Before mounting the pegboard, I located a spot to drill a hole for the power cord for the light. I'm probably going to come back later and drill a similar hole at the bottom to run a power strip so that I can have power accessible right there on the top of the workbench as well. The pegboard goes on with 5/8 of an inch screws around the frame, and that wraps everything up. I'm ready for final install. I couldn't take the old cabinets over to my dad's just yet, so this is a temporary setup over here on this wall. But for final assembly, I'm going to secure the top to the cabinets and the hutch to the top with hidden screws. And here are the screw eyes that I replaced. They're quite a bit shorter and they give you another usable row of the peg holes. Now this workbench is a great low profile spot to work on projects and go through plans for your builds. I think this is going to be a great addition to a lot of people's garages, and I can't wait to get it in its final place and complete the look of my own shop organization. If you want to see some more shop storage videos, there's a link right down there to the playlist. If you want to see another video, I've got one for you right there. If you want plans for this build, there's a link down below in the description. Go check that out. If you're not subscribed to the channel already, I'd love to have you as part of the team. And until next time, guys, get out there and build something awesome.